During the summer of 1962, the Soviets brought weapons into Cuba. President Kennedy, though, did not approve of this. On October 14th, photographers took photographs taken by American planes of the missile bases in Cuba. It revealed that the missiles could reach U.S. cities in minutes. On October 22nd, Kennedy informed the nation of the missile sites in Cuba and his plan to remove them. He declared that any action from Cuba would trigger an all-out attack on the Soviet Union. For the next 6 days, the world faced a possible nuclear war. Since Florida was near Cuba, it was a great focus during the Cold War. In the course of the Cuban crisis, President Kennedy sent 100,000 troops to Florida waiting to invade Cuba. Also, many Cuban refugees that settled in Florida used radio stations to broadcast information to Cuba. Furthermore, Kennedy set up Space Station NASA in Cape Canaveral. After World War II, the U.S. converted from a wartime to a peacetime economy. With more than $135 billion in savings from defense work service pay and investments in war bonds, Americans suddenly had more money to spend, therefore causing Americans to spend more, which increased more job opportunities from the demand of goods and services. Congress passed the Servicemen Readjustment Act in 1944, which guaranteed veterans a year's worth of unemployment benefits while job hunting, thus lowering interest loans. Many families utilized these benefits to buy homes and farms or establish businesses. As soldiers came home from World War II, they settled into family life and caused an unpredicted population explosion known as the baby boom. This occurred throughout the late 1940s and into the 1960s. The result was the largest generation in national history. In 1956, President Eisenhower authorized the building of a national highway network, which was 41,000 miles of expressway. This in turn encouraged the development of new suburbs farther from cities, and it also made high-speed, long-haul trucking possible, which declined the use of railroads. Minorities found it hard to obtain the same prosperity as white middle-class citizens. They were excluded from middle-class jobs and the opportunities to move to the suburbs. African Americans in the South were still tenant farmers, and in the North, they were hired for low-wage jobs. Hispanic Americans in the West were still migrant farm workers. President Johnson's ambitious program to end poverty and racial injustice. Congress passed 206 of his measures, including Medicare, Medicaid, Project Head Start, Immigration Act of 1965, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and many more. These programs did help, but they led to a growing budget deficit, and these programs were overshadowed by the Vietnam War. The Geneva Conference of 1954 split Vietnam into two. The Communists were in the north, and the Vietnamese Empire was in the south. The U.S. replaces France as the South Vietnamese chief supporter. This was because the U.S. feared communism and believed in democracy. Kennedy sends troops to support South Vietnam against North Vietnam. Johnson continues to try for peace. Nixon continues and works out a peace treaty. Ford does nothing when North Vietnam takes control of all of Vietnam. This unites the country under communism and contributes to Americans' lack of faith in the government. The domino theory was a theory prominent from the 1950s to the 1980s that speculated that if one country in a region came under the influence of communism, then the surrounding countries would follow into a domino effect. Domino theory was used by successive U.S. administrations during the Cold War to justify the need for American intervention around the world. Though he never directly used the term domino theory, President Dwight D. Eisenhower put the theory into words during the April 7, 1954 news conference when referring to communism in Indochina. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was an international organization for collective defense in Southeast Asia created by the Southeast Asia Collective Defense Treaty, or Malaya Pact, signed in September 1954 in Malaya, Philippines. The formal institution of CETA was established on February 19, 1955, at the meeting of treaty partners in Bangkok, Thailand. The organization's headquarters was also in Bangkok. 8 members joined the organization. Primarily created to block further communist gains in Southeast Asia, CETA is generally considered a failure because international conflict and dispute. Alleged attacks of U.S. ships by North Vietnamese ships in the Gulf of Tonkin off the North Vietnamese coast that prompts President Johnson to ask for and get broad military powers in Vietnam. Later information reveals the U.S. had been conducting secret raids against North Vietnam, and Johnson had prepared his request to Congress months beforehand. This information begins to lead to America distrust of the government. Surprise attack by Viet Cong in many South Vietnam cities. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually regain control, but this attack and subsequent fighting changes U.S. public opinion. President Nixon's plan to gradually turn over control of the war to the South Vietnamese while slowly withdrawing from U.S. troops. Vietnamization was policy of Richard Nixon administration during the Vietnam War to end U.S. involvement in the war and expand, equip, and train South Vietnamese forces and assign them to an ever-increasing combat role, at the same time steadily reducing the number of U.S. combat troops. Brought on by the Viet Cong's Tet Offensive, the policy referred to U.S. combat troops, specifically in the ground combat role, but did not reject combat by the U.S. Air Force, as well as the support to South Vietnam consisted with the policies of U.S. foreign military assistance organizations. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 intended to establish peace in Vietnam and an end to the Vietnam War. It ended direct U.S. military involvement and temporarily stopped the fighting between the North and South. The governments of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, and the United States, as well as the Provisional Revolutionary Government that represented indigenous South Vietnamese revolutionaries, signed an agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam on January 27, 1973. However, the agreement was not ratified by the United States Senate. During the Vietnam War, America was split in half. One side was called the Hawks, and they were the side that wanted to increase military force and send more troops into Vietnam. The Doves, on the other hand, wanted the opposite and wanted the troops to be withdrawn and settle the war with peace. During the 1972 presidential election on June 17, 1972, a break-in occurred at the Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate Office Complex in Washington, D.C., and the Nixon administration's attempt cover-up of its involvement. When the conspiracy was discovered and investigated by the U.S. Congress, the Nixon administration resisted it and which led to a constitutional crisis, and Americans started to not trust the federal government anymore. Nixon eventually resigns rather than face impeachment. Feminists in the late 1960s proposed to Congress an amendment that guaranteed women's equal rights with men. Both houses approved. The states had 7 years to ratify it. Phyllis Schlafly, however, founded the Stop Era campaign and traveled across the U.S. throughout the 1970s calling for opposition to the era because it would lead to homosexual marriage, women in compact, taxpayer-funded abortion, unisex bathrooms, and elimination of Social Security benefits for widows. By the time ran out, only 35 states ratified it, and it was 3 states shy of the total it needed. During World War II, about 8 million women entered the workforce. Many left the workforce after the war, but by 1960, 40% worked for wages. Most jobs were available to women were poorly paid. They were domestic work, retail sales, teaching, and nursing. President Kennedy's Presidential Commission of the Status of Women brought many discriminatory practices to light with their report in 1963. This brought awareness to women's unequal status in society. Thousands of women actually joined the military during World War II. They replaced men in non-combat positions and got the same pay as men that had the same job. Founded in the first decade of the 20th century to increase job opportunities for African Americans. In 1961, Whitney Young became executive director amidst the expansion of activism in the civil rights movement. This provoked a change for the League. Young substantially expanded the League's fundraising ability and made the League a full partner in the civil rights movement.